So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me, Ria.
I'm so glad that I could have you on. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah. It's good, always good to be sitting in the Radio Al Ansar studios.
Yes, of course, absolutely love that. So I want to get straight into the questions because not only am I intrigued to know all this, but I know our listeners. So, what is estate planning?
Estate planning, Ria, it's an interactive discussion that you'd have with a professional,
Yes.
right? Ultimately, what I do in my estate planning discussions, I would fast forward to a person's date of death as if if you had to die today,
Yes.
what would, and we then focus on the consequences, consequences in terms of the implications on your wealth,
Yes.
your family, the people who are dependent on you.
Yes.
And just basically what would happen, what would be the ripple effect if you were to die today?
Yes.
And then we work backwards, because then we look at what do we do to reduce your death costs,
Yes.
because there are significant costs at death,
100%.
right? We identify the complications and we determine how those complications can be mitigated. And then we eventually finish off with the creation of a will. So we prepare a will that speaks to your lived realities, that deals with as much as possible those complications. And in between, if there are certain agreements or documents that need to be drafted, those will get drafted as well.
Okay.
So that's basically just a sort of holistic perspective of a person's life and their circumstances, and how do you reduce the chaos if you were to die today?
Yes. Okay, awesome. And then what is a trust? Can you tell us that?
Sure. A trust is a legal entity. Okay, so let's just imagine what, for example, a company would be, right? In a company, you'd have a company is not something you can touch and feel, but it exists as a legal entity, right? So a company would have directors, would be the managers. Okay, they would manage the business. And then you'd have shareholders who own the business. So every time the managers do their work and they make a profit for the business, that profit then gets shared amongst the shareholders. Okay, so the shareholders would obviously want to appoint managers who know what they're doing, right? Similarly, a trust, and remember, a company is created to make profit. Okay, because it's a business transactional entity. A trust, on the other hand, is an entity very similar to a company, where you have someone whose aspiration is to create some sort of security or legacy for their loved ones, okay? Or even for the community. You date back to our Islamic history. The concept of a waqf was created, which is a charitable trust for the benefit of the community. And so a trust is an entity which seeks to protect family members or a group of people.
Okay.
So you'll have the founder who creates the trust, okay? And then you'll have the trustees who manage the trust. So they'll manage the assets that are owned by the trust to make sure that it's well maintained, or that it's still generating a profit or income, and it's not running at a loss, okay? And then who are we trying to do all of this for? It's the beneficiaries. So the beneficiaries then benefit from the profitability of the trust assets being managed properly.
Okay.
So it's a very useful tool for estate planning, because it reduces your costs at death, because if you don't, when you move assets into a trust, you're moving them out of your personal name into an independent entity. So you no longer own that property.
Okay.
It's the trust which owns that property. So when you die, then you aren't dying with that property or that asset in your name to increase your expenses, your death expenses, because that property is owned by the third party, being the trust. But because you may be the beneficiary of that trust, you benefit from the way that asset is managed, or you may have access to the property, so you can live in the property, or benefit from the profits that come out of the investment of that asset.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so if I had to question, why would I need a will as a young person who has no wealth?
Okay, so we live in a very regulated environment. We have laws. So
Yes.
lawyers don't just thumb suck rules. Okay, we have laws that
Yeah.
that are created so that our society or community can function appropriately. In terms of South African law, we have what we call the Wills Act.
Yes.
And the Wills Act stipulates that if you are 16 years and older, you should have a will. Okay, so in
Yes.
essence, what the Wills Act is saying, a person who's 16 years and older can make a will. Okay, it'll be a
Yes.
legal valid document. But based on that, I would encourage that every person who is 16 years and older should have a will, because there are certain decisions that need to be made when you pass on, and we must be realistic. We assume that we will be the last to die, but I mean that could happen anyway. I mean, and many of us would know of very close people to us who passed away not because of old age. In their youth they've passed away, and if they own certain things, then at least the will helps to manage those items and ensures that those items go to the appropriate people. So I think it's critical to have a will.
Yes.
You may have, young people could also have children. So a will is a very important tool to determine who should take care of your children. It guides the courts in determining who should take care of your children if both parents have passed on. And some of us may have pets.
Yes, of course.
And those pets have sentimental value to us, and we may want those pets to go to or be taken care of by a certain person, But even then, I mean, we have our personal items. You mentioned electronic gadgets and things like that. You may want to give those personal items to somebody.
Yes.
Sometimes those personal items may not have commercial value, but they hold immense sentimental value. And it can create such heartache or disputes in families if those personal items don't go to the appropriate people. And then part of estate planning is not only about planning for one's death, but also to plan for one's lifetime. So you could have a situation where you no longer have the capacity to make certain decisions. You become incapacitated. And so at least if you can have certain documents in place to deal with that, like a power of attorney or things like that, to guide your family members. Well, not the power of attorney if you're incapacitated, but I mean there can be certain decisions or you can put into place which will assist in terms of your the management of your health or the management of your finances. So a will would, in a sense, not guide that, because a will deals with death. But the whole estate planning discussion, I think, deals with those issues. And ultimately, I think a will just creates clarity, reduces the chaos, as I always say, because it stipulates who the executor should be, who your guardian of your children should be, who the beneficiaries ought to be, so it adds clarity and it prevents potential disagreements amongst one's loved ones.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm coming to knock on your door soon. So how is an Islamic will different from a civil will?
Okay, so in terms of our civil laws, if you have firstly, I must say that we must also understand that if we don't have a will, then we die intestate. But I'll speak a little more about that later. But if we have a will, we have, in terms of South African law, this concept called freedom of testation.
Okay.
So in terms of freedom of testation, we can say whatever we want to in our wills. So while Islamic law may not be a recognized legal system in terms of our law in South Africa, but because of this principle of freedom of testation, we can stipulate that we want our wealth to devolve in terms of Islamic law. And therefore we can then, in a sense, allow for the Islamic rules of succession or the Sharia to apply to our affairs. And that's very, very useful. So an Islamic will then has what we say fixed heirship rules.
Yes.
Okay. So yes, we have in terms of a civil will, you can declare whatever you want to. Whoever I often refer to the will as a who gets what document.
Yes.
So in your civil will, you'll be able to say, I want all my wealth to go to the SPCA, or I want all my wealth to go to my best friend, or my parents, or whoever. You have that discretion, that freedom of testation. In terms of Islamic wills, the wills are drafted a bit differently. So yes, while there'll be commonality in terms of appointing executors and guardians, but in terms of the who gets what aspect, Islamic law has fixed heirship rules, and your default or the first set of beneficiaries to an Islamic estate would be your parents, your spouse or spouses if it's a polygynous marriage, and children. So those are your compulsory heirs. Okay, and then there are certain rules that apply to how those compulsory heirs benefit. So the proportions in which they benefit. So all of that is stipulated in terms of the Quran. Okay, it's very specific, and it's a very sort of a technical calculation. But with technology, with AI, with Google, there are lots of tools that can help guide us. So you could just Google in Islamic inheritance calculator, and you punch in all the people that would be left if you were to pass on, and it will give you a little sort of breakdown of who your beneficiaries would be, and who your and what proportions they would inherit. In terms of Islamic law, we have the opportunity, it's not compulsory, we have an opportunity to bequeath up to a maximum of 1/3 to any beneficiary or to any individual or charity that is not a compulsory beneficiary. So if your compulsory beneficiaries are parents, spouse, and children, you may have a sibling, or you may have a best friend, or somebody out there who you want to give something to. So you've got that latitude of up to a maximum of 1/3 to give to those beneficiaries.
Okay.
And the other thing I found quite interesting is that the Shafi'i rules and the Hanafi rules also operate differently. So if you are a person who holds strongly to a particular ideology, then you need to look at that, because in terms of the Shafi'i rules, your Islamic obligations, like for example, if you have unpaid zakah and things like that, comes out of your general estate liabilities, so your expenses and your debts. But in terms of Hanafi rules, those expenses come out of that special bequest.
Okay.
You see? So it's those little technicalities that it's important to get appropriate Sharia guidance, on that. But yeah, the difference, the critical difference, I think, is that the bequest is limited to a maximum of 1/3.
Okay.
And then your beneficiaries are limited to your compulsory heirs would be your parents, spouse, and children in specific proportions. And beyond that, so for example, if you only have daughters and you don't have sons, then of course siblings come in and things like that.
Yes. Okay, so what would happen if a Gen Z dies, and what are the legal processes?
Okay, so when a Gen Z or any individual
of course
in South Africa passes away, their estates have to, all our estates, all of us sitting around this room, all our estates, even our sound engineer, all our estates are going to have to go through an administration process. Okay, so it's the Master's Office or the Master of the High Court which regulates, it's that arm of the Department of Justice that regulates that administration process. So it's not the High Court, it's the Master of the High Court. Okay. And the person who's reporting the estate, generally the executor or the attorney of the executor, would have to compile a set of documents which would include the will and lodge that with the master. The master will examine these documents, and based on the documents that they receive, will appoint an executor. And the executor then steps into the shoes of the deceased to collect all the assets belonging to the deceased, pay off the liabilities and expenses, including SARS, and then whatever's the balance, make sure that that balance goes to the heirs in terms of the will. If there is no will, doesn't mean that everything gets forfeited to the state or disappears. It just means then that government steps in to determine the who gets what.
Yes, yes.
So if we have freedom of testation in terms of our wills, to stipulate that in our will, when we don't leave a will, then government steps in but through the legislation called the Intestate Succession Act to determine who, for example, would be the executor and who would be the beneficiaries of our wealth. Okay. And that's fine. At least we have that as a solution. But the only problem is then sometimes what happens is you have an executor that gets appointed whom you wouldn't have wanted to get appointed, or beneficiaries whom you wouldn't want to benefit, who invariably get inheriting the estate. So you want to be able to control that process because you've worked for whatever you have.
Yes.
So it's always recommended that we have a will. Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So how do we ensure that our estate is administered in terms of Islamic laws?
Well, that would mean that we have to draft an Islamic will. And while look, we've got the Prophet ﷺ has cautioned us that we should not go 3 nights of sleep without having secured a will, without having prepared or signed a will. So we must take care of our financial affairs. It's a critical responsibility on us, to do that. So if you want to have your estate administered in terms of Islamic law, then you must get appropriate Sharia estate planning guidance. Okay. If you don't have complications in your life, then by all means do the standard wills that you get from the ulama or from the internet or whatever it is, right? If you don't have complications. But I find that more and more we have certain complications that need attention, that need specific attention, So get appropriate advice, so Sharia estate planning advice, because there are some, we may assume, okay, there are fixed rules around inheritances, what the wife gets, what the husband gets, or what children get. But if you understand, if you get good guidance from a Sharia estate planning expert, then there are certain exceptions to the rules that you can incorporate in your will. Okay? So, yes, to have your estate administered in terms of Islamic law, you must have a will. If you don't have a will, then remember government steps in with the Intestate Succession Act, and then the consequences are not going to be in terms of the Sharia. And then to put that right is very costly. Okay? It's arduous and it's costly, and I think it creates a lot of hardship to the people that are left behind. Very importantly, it's important to appoint an executor. And if you want to add a few more Sharia compliant inheritance clauses in your will, you may do so. In essence, your Sharia will differs from a normal civil will only by one clause mainly. The clause says, I bequeath my entire estate to my heirs in terms of Sharia, okay, or the Islamic rules of inheritance, and that's the primary clause that goes into a Sharia will, which is different to an ordinary will. Okay, but there's no other differences, and the process to wind up an estate of a Sharia will is exactly the same as it is for any other estate. So you still have to report at the master's office. You still have to appoint an executor. You still have to follow the regulations in terms of advertisements and accounts and things like that if your estate has a certain value. The rules are a lot more informal if your estate has a smaller value. And the master uses, it's gazetted values. If your total estate is less than 250,000, then it's one of what you would call the quick and fast, right? So your estate then gets resolved much quicker, right? But if it's in excess of 250,000, then there's a whole process of advertisements and accounts and all sorts of things. And I think that we must be aware with the cost of living or the cost of acquiring assets. It's very easy to go beyond that 250,000 threshold. You can't buy a decent vehicle today for 50,000, right? So you buy a vehicle, you may own a property, or you may have an investment, and suddenly, very quickly, you go above that threshold, which means that the process to wind up your estate is going to be longer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what are common challenges that come up in the estate of an individual Gen Z?
I think not having a will.
Mm.
Many young people, in fact, many adults as well,
Yes.
believe that, I don't have much, so I don't need to have a will.
Yeah.
But as I said, you should have a will.
It's
And we
important.
discussed the reasons,
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And it has nothing to do with value. So as long as you have a will, your estate has to be reported.
Okay.
That's in terms of the Wills Act, right? And as long as you have assets or own assets in excess of 1,000 rand,
Yes.
your estate has to be reported because someone has to be put in charge of
Yes.
that, even if it's a small amount of money, right? So because many people don't think they need a will, then it tends to lead to confusion. It leads to delays in the administration process. It can lead to disputes. And if we understand the process, I mean, I've just summarized very quickly what the process is.
Yes.
Report the estate, appoint the executor, contact creditors, pay off the liabilities, and then transfer assets. I've just kind of summarized in like 4 or 5 steps, right?
Yes.
But the process is arduous. The reality is that when a person dies, their heirs are only likely to receive their inheritances with all the compliance checks we need to place 2 years down the line. So to wait 2 years before you inherit wealth, your inheritance from either a parent or a spouse or whoever it is, just so that you can continue with your life and pay your expenses is a long time.
It is.
You know, so when you have a will, at least it reduces those delays. You mentioned digital assets. You know, I think many Gen Zs have valuable digital assets like cryptocurrencies, NFTs, your social media accounts, subscription, online subscriptions, and these are difficult to manage if proper instructions aren't in place. I know that it's tricky with passwords, okay, but we have to find a way of storing our passwords or giving it to somebody that we really, really trust, okay, because a lot of wealth can be lost if we don't, if those who are living are not given the appropriate information, okay. The other thing is you may find that you may have certain expenses like student loans or things like that, which on your death may have certain implications. Okay. So you want to also deal with that. Some people, I mean, adults or people who have wealth may want to purchase a property. So you take a loan with the bank to purchase that property. And then when you pass on, if you haven't finished paying off that loan or that bond, you may find that your loved ones may actually lose that property because there isn't sufficient money to settle that bond. But there are structures such as insurance policies that cover the bond or that cover, and it's Sharia compliant, that cover your death costs, you know, such as estate duty. So it's important to put those into place. And if we don't, you know, it creates complications. The other thing I must also mention, which is a common challenge, not only to Gen Z, but just everyone, we don't identify what assets we do have. You know? We go through life just assuming that we're going to see things through to the end. But we don't keep a record of what we have and what our expenses are. So that's very, very important. And we need to keep those records. If we find that there isn't someone we can trust, we need to then instruct a professional and give those records. I create what I call a lifestyle file for my clients, where I'll keep a copy of the logbook of the vehicle. I'll keep a bank statement or confirmation letter with the banking details or a copy of the policy document, just so that we can start putting things together so that when my client passes away, I have sufficient information to wind up that estate. I want to end on this last point. There are 3 things certain in life, Ria. It's life, death, and SARS. Right? So we often neglect the role that SARS plays in terms of compliance in our lives. We may not, we may come from a history where we don't get tax registered and things like that. But SARS has a focus to monitor us from the cradle to the grave. That's their focus, you
Yes.
know. And they know that there are a lot of Gen Zers out there who are earning an income online, but who aren't reflecting that income with SARS.
Yes.
So very soon you're going to find for every child born, SARS is going to want an income tax.
Yes, indeed.
So it's very important for us to start living so that we structure our lives so that we are compliant.
Yes,
so we become SARS compliant so that it doesn't become hard later on. It's a grudge issue. Honestly, it is. It's difficult, but we have to incorporate it so that every time we make a decision to buy, to sell, bear in mind the SARS implication and comply. Because if you don't comply now, there's going to be a huge impact later because there's no way that SARS will not let go of you. You know?
100%. Well, Jazakallah, it was absolutely lovely having you on today, and I really appreciate it.
Only a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I hope
so
it added
glad.
value. And thank you to the sound engineer for keeping us sounding good.
Well, there you have it. Rumana Mahomed, the most amazing attorney ever. Now it's time to wrap up. I mean, today was absolutely lovely, but we have unfortunately reached the end of today's program. But I'll be back next week, Thursday, October 24th from